All right. So welcome to this, the fourth webinar in the Youth Ministry Training Series, Pastoral Care to and with Youth. I am Jennica Davis-Hockett, Leadership Development Associate for the Office of Youth and Young Adult Ministries, and I run programs like Summer Seminary, Luminary Leaders, Youth Caucus at General Assembly, and I also do curriculum development like the new Bringing the Web to Life curriculum that the Office of Youth and Young Adult Ministries just put out, and I will pass it over to Nancy.
Hello, dear ones. I'm Nancy Combs-Morgan. I'm the Congregational Life Consultant in the MidAmerica region and also the Faith Development Program Manager. I have served in this capacity. This is my 13th year with a specialty in Youth and Young Adult Ministries. I also have experience as a chaplain and have done trauma response with a specialty with working with adolescents and youth. In addition, a Chrysalis trainer for the Chrysalis Youth Chaplaincy Training, and I'm delighted to be with you all here tonight. Let us center ourselves and let us set aside this time of intentional learning by invoking this beautiful reading by a prayer by Frederick Gillis. From many places and conditions of the Spirit, we come, seeking a center for our lives, a sense of wholeness. From dry places where the words and knowledge seem broken, into brittle fragments that do not cohere. From overfilled places where information abounds and there is no real understanding. From hard places where feelings are dulled, and lonely, hollow places where meanings seem empty. In this caring and supportive community, filled with the Spirit that flows in and among us and throughout the world, enable us to find that power that already lies within us, a power for love, for creativity, for hope. Open our eyes to the possibilities of love and sustenance that already surround and uphold us, and may our hearts be open to compassion and our minds open to wisdom, and may it be so.
Thank you, Nancy. So we've introduced ourselves and you've heard a little bit about us, and now we'd love to know more about you. So we have so many people on tonight, we won't be able to do mics, but if you would, please open your chat box and let us know where you're calling from, what your role is, and how many people you are watching this webinar with. Oh, we've got Houston and Columbia. Oh, Nashville, New York. Oh my gosh, they're flowing by so fast. Okay, so keep doing that. I'm going to watch everybody roll in and I'll pass it on to Nancy.
Let us begin with an intentionality to share a vision of Unitarian youth ministry that helps to create, and let us help to create spirit-filled communities of care, of deep care, covenant, consent, and creativity. Unitarian Universalist youth and adult leaders care deeply. We know this. Let's say it out loud. They care deeply for one another and place a great importance on the deep connections made in our congregations and at regional and national gatherings. I've seen this over and over again. One of the reasons I became so interested in providing and helping to do pastoral care to and with youth is the experiences that I've had in youth communities. There is a deep care expressed there. Throughout the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, there is an intentionality to ensure that all youth and adults have safe and inclusive experiences. To be inclusive, we must create and be in the process of creating and have a goal of creating communities of care which are mindful and purposeful about pastoral care. Pastoral care begins with an openness of heart, hopefully a faith that calls each of us to care for all beings and a willingness to be attuned to oneself and others.
So the core task of all pastoral care is enabling spiritual healing and growth. Do you have to be a minister to provide pastoral care? No. Do you have to be suffering greatly to receive pastoral care? No. Pastoral care is sort of like making music. Yes, there are skilled professionals, and there is definitely a realm of complexity that should be left to them, but everyone can be healed by listening to or making music. So like music, pastoral care can be an instrument of healing and growth. And by helping to develop what is most difficult to achieve, depth in relationships. So when we care deeply for each other in spiritual community, we begin to build community-sustaining relationships. And is that not truly a radical act in this age of distraction and individualism and isolation? And at the core of true, compassionate pastoral care is a kind of listening, a relational attentiveness. Pastoral care requires of us a willingness to truly hear and truly see one another. Have you ever heard the quote by a Norwegian poet, Arne Garnsborg, who says, "To love a person is to learn the song that is in their heart and to sing it back to them when they have forgotten." Being pastoral means responding with sensitive awareness. And as faith-based people, we are called to sensitively respond. So to be pastoral doesn't mean to have all the answers. It's simply to have an awareness, to be aware, to witness disorientation or isolation or brokenheartedness, as well as joy and celebration and transition. And that is really a great gift. Pastoral care is to be with one another in relationship, both sharing beauty and tragedy, joy and sorrow, and hope and despair. Pastoral care is a spiritual practice of engaging fully in the depth and the breadth of human experience as it is, not as we hope it would be. It contains celebrating and comforting, laughing and crying together, but most often it is simply waiting and listening. Pastoral care is often an art of relaxing your grip on outcome and releasing control. So because we are continually striving to be radically inclusive, multicultural and anti-racist communities, and welcoming communities for LGBTQ plus siblings, our pastoral care has to reflect that. Our congregations are the most likely places where we can care for the spiritual lives of our young people, and we need to be inclusive of all their identities. And this Trump presidency has already reminded us that LGBT, queer, and questioning youth and young adults can face homophobia and transphobia because of their gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. And our pastoral care must affirm sexuality as a healthy part of human development and support a critical perspective on media images of our sexuality, gender roles, and body image, and encourage young people to develop a healthy self-image. And youth and young adults of color face racism and exoticism because of their race and ethnicity, and our pastoral care must support youth and young adults of color by acknowledging the pain caused by interpersonal and institutional racism, providing tools to explore racial and ethnic identity, encouraging community building with other youth and young adults of color, seeking role models for youth and young adults of color who need them, and respecting the importance of every person's racial and ethnic heritage. And our pastoral care needs also to tend to the spiritual needs of youth and young adults who benefit from systems of oppression, helping them to recognize their privilege and process their emotions and know that the beloved community embraces them. So there are some elements of providing pastoral care, and the first is empathy, and that's the ability to actually feel what others feel. This is different than sympathy, which is being able to say, oh yeah, I've been there, I know what that's like. And empathy is actually being able to hold the perspective of somebody else. And through mirror neurons in our brain, we are actually biologically predisposed to being empathetic creatures. So let's do a little experiment real quick. Think of me biting into a big, huge, juicy lemon. And as you think of me biting into that lemon, what happens in your mouth? Well, those are your mirror neurons firing. That right there is empathy, being able to feel what I'm feeling. Oh, and I want to go back. And the second is clarification. To be truly empathetic, we have to ask clarifying questions to ensure that we're clear on what another person is feeling, not on what we think they're feeling. And clarification also helps another to tune into what they're feeling. And also silence. In our daily experience, we're often more comfortable with noise, which can be a tool for distraction. And when we take the distraction away and really revel in the silence, even if it's uncomfortable, surprising truths can emerge. Another surprising element, pardon me. I was surprised actually when I realized that confrontation was an element of pastoral care. Sometimes pastoral care takes the form of shining a light on what we'd rather not see, naming the things we may be afraid to name because it might incite conflict, but this can actually begin a healing process. Another element is support and comfort. You know, there's a quote, you probably have heard it, that God never gives you anything you can't handle. Well, notice in that quote, it's not God never gave you anything that you can't handle by yourself. So sometimes we each need buttressing and buoying and that support. And the last is guidance and sustenance. So while pastoral care is not about fixing or solving another person's problems, it can be about providing a perspective for somebody when they can't see the forest for the trees.
In introducing ideas of being a community of care, radical hospitality is certainly a core aspect. Weekly in our congregations, the echoing themes of welcome and warm hospitality are hopefully lifted up so that all, I repeat, all feel truly welcomed. As Unitarian Universalists, we seek to create environments and experiences where those who are treated unfairly in any other context can be welcomed completely, wholly, without fear. For all youth and adults to feel truly welcomed, we must ensure that all of our rituals and practices are welcoming, inclusive, and mindful of personal boundaries. Being conscious of neurodiversity, that spectrum of how we learn and interact, take in information, how we literally receive the world at large, our physical ability, our gender expression, and cultural differences. And if we actively seek input and evolve based on that feedback from people of all ages who experience oppression or are distressed, this will raise our consciousness. So the platinum rule, be inclusive in the ways people want to be included and mindful of personal boundaries, which requires everything that Jennica was talking about, listening carefully to one another. So let us be inclusive in the ways people want to be included.
So the foundation of these communities of care that we're talking about tonight is covenant. So it's important to build and maintain a thoughtful covenant within your youth ministry Creating, continually lifting up, and repairing your covenant is the way that we practice an ethic of caring for one another in community. The covenant should include a review of confidentiality, including what information needs to stay confidential within the group, what needs to be shared with the DRE or minister, and how do we talk about what we learned about other people's stories without sharing other people's stories. Hopefully, your covenant will include wisdom of how we care for ourselves and one another. Oftentimes we use covenants as a list of do's and don'ts or behavior guidelines, especially in youth ministry. And it is true, adolescents are developmentally tuned to thriving within concrete boundaries. So rules are good, but covenants are not about rules. Covenants that feel as if they're about rules or rule breaking don't really embody the covenantal purpose. So sticking with this metaphor of the road as our spiritual journey, youth do need traffic lights. They need rules to keep them safe. But this is also a really great time developmentally to help them practice their agency to enter into agreements willingly about looking beyond oneself towards the health of the community as a whole. So covenants are like the trees that line the road. They shape our path and they point towards the horizon. Covenants are living agreements of how we care for one another, which puts the greater good of the community as its primary purpose. So in that, I mentioned before, the Bringing the Web to Life curriculum by the Office of Youth and Young Adult Ministries, there's an hour-long session, session 2, on creating covenant together, and that link is down at the bottom of the slide. In this workshop can be done with a small group, or if you do some modifications, which I'd be happy to show you, you can do this workshop with more than 100 youth and adults. Basically, participants form small groups and discuss their answers to one of a series of questions that they're given, and from those small groups, a collective covenant is built. So the questions move the covenant away from a list of rules or behavior guidelines towards aspirations for how we want to care for each other. So the first question is, how do we treat ourselves? How do we treat each other? How do we communicate? How do we treat our space? How do we treat those who are not part of the group? How do we uphold our faith? How do we become people others can count on? What sacrifices are we willing to make in the name of the highest good? And how do we make amends? And as I'm reading through these again, I'm remembering the times that I've done this with small groups and with large groups, and I am simply astounded with what groups are able to come up with, that it's not something any one person could come up with on their own. It really is quite incredible. So given the maturity level of the group, you might need quite a bit of adult input to help youth get to the heart of these questions. So for example, on this how do we make amends question, youth may need some prompting to think beyond like, oh, we'll just take it on a case-by-case basis, to be able to go a little deeper. And for some groups who are familiar with and well-versed in the sort of youth culture community, and who are familiar with terms like take space, make space, and don't harsh my mellow, and all the stuff that usually ends up on covenants, this aspirational format might work really well for them because they've had experience. But for groups for whom this is totally new, it might be worth going back through the statements that they create and actually coming up with the concrete behaviors that reflect these aspirational statements. And our covenants are living documents, but sometimes they get a little dusty if there's no one actually assigned to call us back to it frequently. So I would suggest after you create your covenant with your youth group, you identify a couple of folks, or they self-identify, who are interested in being on a sort of youth group lay pastoral share the care team that could be covenant minders and that can call the group back to the covenant and continually ask, how are we doing on our covenant?
That's a shift change in thinking. Actually, having adult and youth lay pastoral care teams in our congregations. This is a remarkable move forward. It demonstrates in a holistic way how we can truly care for one another, and there are real concrete good ideas behind this. It is a demonstration of practicing generous hospitality. So if you already have a lay pastoral care team of youth and adults, but particularly youth who are keeping this lens before them, they're aware of when youth are visiting, perhaps for the first or second time. And if there is this lay pastoral care team, they make sure that there are at least two youth leaders, either on that team or other youth, who are ready to be those youth group greeters. They hopefully model the group learning those individuals who are visiting, not just their names, but a sense of who they are and where they're from. We often exhibit a closed circle, even physically or are in many ways. It's quite intimidating to come and visit a youth group for a new youth. And so it's so important to have these greeters, not just out at the front of the church at the greeting table, but actually in the youth group room. Also make sure that your room is set up to be hospitable. That's a way of showing deep care to make sure that the room is completely accessible. And there is that sense of invitation. So maintain and institute a practice of introductions, not just the first or couple, the first sessions of youth group of the year, but ongoing a practice of hospitality introductions. And this is also a bit of a shift change. Within MidAmerica, and I've been across the country, there is a declaration often when folks are asked to introduce themselves to declare what their pronouns are. This should be an invitation. It should not be an absolute, you have to do that. There should be an invitational quality to sharing those pronouns. Some of you may have experienced community attention as a process of being a community of care. If any of you have taken part in any of the youth leadership schools across the country, this is a practice that we use regularly at the Youth Midwest Leadership School. A community attention process actually involves youth advisors with that lay pastoral care team who could introduce this. And they attend to this, whether it's an envelope or a box or a folder that actually says community attention on it and has cards and things to write with. It's a powerful method of taking the pulse beat of the group, and it allows voices who would not share otherwise to name something which is laying joyously upon their hearts or heavily upon their hearts. It's a way to observe process. Many of you have heard of process observation. Community attention can act that way. If it's a regular practice, encourage people to actually indicate who they are on the card. These are not anonymous observations. But if there is a regular time when your lay pastoral care providers can say, let's look at this community attention, whether it's after a chalice lighting, so make it sort of a regular ritual. And if you are a member of that lay pastoral care team as an adult, don't hesitate to add your own card to the community attention, even expressing joy. I see hospitality and deep care being practiced throughout this youth group, and it opens my heart like a lotus flower. I mean, it sounds sort of flowery, but don't hesitate to say something on your own as well.
So yes, rituals and traditions are so important to institute to create this sense of regularity around communities of care. And rituals and traditions can reach beyond youth group as well. Our congregations and communities are some of the few places left in our culture where mutually respectful and beneficial multi-generational relationships can thrive. And even though youth and young adults may not be official members of the congregation, pastoral care teams really should consider them as part of their ministry. There are many reasons that youth and young adults may not be official members, including the inability to contribute financially or not knowing where they're going to be in a year or two. And so these things should not be barriers to belonging to a caring community. So think about the last time youth and adults in your congregation interacted with one another. My guess is that most of you thought of a time where the youth were on stage doing the Sunday service or performing a task like cleaning up or asking for money from a fundraiser. These things are not uncommon, but multi-generational relationships are not built when we perform for one another or through financial transactions. Relationships are built when we care for one another. And there are plenty of ways to create non-transactional, low-risk relationships between generations that respect the developmental stage of youth. If the pastoral care team is to think of youth as part of their ministry, one thing that they could do is to gather photos of the youth with their parents and their consent, of course, and comment cards written by the youth with statements about just something big happening in their life currently. Maybe it's a big test or a new job or a recent breakup. And the pastoral care team could spend 10 minutes at the beginning or end of their meeting praying for or meditating on the youth's photos and really calling into their hearts these youth in their times of success or trial. And mid and late adolescence is a time of really a lot of stress with a lot of pressure to succeed and a lot of transitions. And I know a lot of congregations will take the time to send care packages to their youth and young adults during finals or in their first year at college or first year away from home or when they start a new job, just to let them know that even if they're not able to attend every single Sunday, that you still really, really care about them. Another thing I've seen congregations start to do is to start to change the narrative around bridging. For a long time, the message around bridging was, good luck, it was great to have you, we're really gonna miss you. And they've begun to change the narrative to really honor the continued relationship, even if it's new, even if it's different or changed, to honor the continued relationship that youth have with their congregation after they bridge out of youth group. And you could ask congregants to write notes of encouragement to give as a gift to the bridging youth. And since youth and young adults are more likely to be without a car, you could include them in the ride offering network just as you would elders who were unable to drive or didn't have a car. So you'll have to have a conversation with your leadership team about how offering rides to minors would fit with your safe congregations policies. But this is a way to just say, we want you here, we'll help you get here. And young people can also offer care. They can participate in pastoral care networks in meaningful, and this is important, in developmentally appropriate ways, maybe by signing birthday cards or condolence cards that the pastoral care team then sends to members. And this is another way to help youth gain the perspective that we are all transitioning all throughout our lives, that it's not just adolescence that is a time of major transition. Young people could offer their services to members who are moving or otherwise need help around the home. And again, being mindful of your safe congregations policies when working on projects like this. They could cook meals or go grocery shopping for congregants who are sick or otherwise unable to cook or shop for themselves. And as you use, sometimes we focus our attention on the needs of people beyond our own community, forgetting that within our own walls, sometimes we have folks who are in need of a little extra care. There is a great project called the Congregational History Project, and it's a PDF that I will include in the resource list that we'll send out after this. But it's basically a way for the congregation to collect its own history through its members. And wouldn't it be cool if the high school youth group was charged with interviewing elders as they told their life stories and the stories of the congregation? And you know, multi-generational pastoral care really does take a considerable amount of relationship building. Lay leaders are going to need to know the youth that are now part of their ministry, and it's probably also going to take some tweaking to the system so that the ministry can be more inclusive of youth. For example, if a youth wants to serve on the pastoral care team or the casserole committee or whatever it's called in your congregation, but the team meets at noon on Tuesdays and only communicates via email, well, that may be too many barriers for a youth to overcome. So really thinking about how to make the pastoral care network in your congregation welcoming and inclusive to youth who want to participate, who want to give back to the community that's meant so much to them is really important as well.
So moving on to the practical, to some of the ways to implement these methods of demonstrating deep care and pastoral care, you really need to explore early in the year which youth are particularly interested or equipped or have the temperament to really expand their pastoral care skills. Find out, if possible, if there is a Chrysalis youth chaplaincy training in your area, and then send at least 2 adults and 2 youth or more to that training, not necessarily with the absolute, this makes you officially a member of the lay pastoral care team. This is just a way to expand their skills so that when they come back, they actually meet with the youth, the other youth advisors, they meet with the minister, they meet with the DRE, and they talk about some of the things that they learned there so that they can be a part of your congregation's youth group lay pastoral care team. So throughout the year, those designated folks can keep a lens, a pastoral care awareness in the youth group and also at multi-generational events, who understand that they are working in a team approach with youth advisors and the DRE. You're going to hear that repeatedly through this webinar. It's all about a team approach, folks. And again, the shift change for some of you may be thinking about the fact that youth can serve with you on this lay pastoral care team, but be honest early on that you always will be circling back and involving and talking regularly with your DRE and your minister. Have a youth group session on the importance of maintaining healthy self-awareness and boundaries. This also highlights that healthy self-awareness is where you, the adult youth advisor or the adult who is helping youth ministry in your congregation, this is where you need to begin with your own healthy self-awareness and making sure that you're approaching this work with an openness of heart, but also with the skills to be truly helpful. Something that I saw, and it began almost 15 years ago here in the MidAmerica region at our youth conferences, was a process of seeking consent around hugging with adults and youth, and also hugging with youth and youth. And I think this is pretty much across the country, and perhaps also in Canada, there is this process of seeking consent. Even sometimes at the beginning of youth conferences, you'll see a skit of demonstrating how to seek consent. And to me, this really was highlighting a sensitivity that I hadn't seen before, especially with our more adult-focused congregations. And that skit often is approaching one another, where people have the option to put their hands up to actually demonstrate that they do not want to be hugged, but also the fact that adults shouldn't hold on too long. That's just one example of demonstrating healthy self-awareness and boundaries.
Another really great skill to teach is active listening. And this may not be a very engaging slide, but I chose it because Caleb was our chaplain at Youth Caucus last year at General Assembly. And I can just see in his face his ability to be wholeheartedly present, to listen to others. And you can see it in his body language. And he really didn't say a whole lot on staff, but he was one of the most active participants in his ability to listen and to provide that service for others. So youth can learn practice, and teach active listening skills. And that's actually the 5th session in that Bringing the Web to Life curriculum that I keep mentioning. And understanding and using nonverbal communication like silence, body language, eyes and facial expressions, space, volume control, which I know we're having a little bit of trouble with on this webinar, but tone, using all those nonverbal communication skills to show compassion and understanding, it comes naturally to some. And it doesn't come naturally to all folks, though. So teaching and practicing active listening skills is really, really beneficial. And it can be especially helpful for youth with autism or Asperger's, and for neurotypical youth who care about their peers who are neurologically different from them, so that they can understand that these are actually skills that are learned and practiced rather than just human nature. And that active listening session teaches skills like paraphrasing, synthesizing, and asking probing questions to help youth practice that clarification and confrontation elements of pastoral care that we mentioned earlier. Youth often tell me that it is such a relief to realize that pastoral care is not about fixing or solving other people's problems, but it's about being present with them. And as an adult, as you are practicing active listening, you'll have to note for yourself what it's going to be important to share with, like Nancy has been mentioning, the rest of your team with whatever comes up in your youth ministry sessions. Because the truth is, youth are going to encounter difficult or crisis situations with their friends or with their peers, whether they're ready to handle it or not. And youth need developmentally appropriate crisis management skills. So sometimes just listening is not an appropriate response. Sometimes just listening may be too hard emotionally to do. So it's so important to talk with youth, because I promise they're not having these conversations in school or in their extracurricular clubs. They're having these conversations about confidentiality in their congregations. It's so important to talk with them and help them to know what to do, who to go to when a peer tells them that they're being harmed or that they're harming themselves. It's so important to talk to our youth and help them understand the difference between keeping confidentiality and keeping a toxic secret.
I've noticed some of the chat box that folks are having a hard time hearing me. Is the sound any bit better holding this? Can you hear me a little bit better? A little bit. Okay, then. So let's move forward. How do we attend to, when we create safe spaces, we don't know what will be invoked. And with youth, just like people of all ages, they deal with grief, loss, stress, transition, addiction, and loneliness. So how can we attend to warning signs that we should be mindful of? Warning signs, and again, using a team approach, be sure to talk with other advisors, your DRE, your minister, when youth demonstrate these particular signs. A dramatic change in emotional state. Yes, there is often, it's normative for teenagers to demonstrate a wide range of emotions. But if you are in relationship with the youth in your youth group, you have a sense already of who they are and how they interact with others. If all of a sudden there is a radical change, a lack of affect, a complete withdrawn quality, that's something to be mindful of. Also, something that has been documented is that any youth who is considering or experiencing suicidal ideation, they often begin to give away their possessions. They will actually come to youth group and begin to give away their possessions. That is a warning sign, a red flag. Also, if you see a shift change in the type of relationships, if you have youth who have articulated that they are having significant behavioral health issues, perhaps a history of their own suicide attempts or suicidal ideation, and a youth who perhaps has not demonstrated that before, who then becomes sort of fixed, doing a lot of outside time with that person, that is a warning sign that there is something perhaps going on, a change in a behavioral health aspect around that suicidal ideation. Also, and again, with teens, they are dealing with a huge number of variables in their world that create stress. But there is a difference with a youth who is absolutely irritable, distracted, not able to manage the stress, who is perhaps pulling at their clothing or tearing bits of paper repeatedly. These are indicating very, very high levels of stress. Something that we've seen at youth conferences in MidAmerica and also at our leadership school is that all of a sudden when youth are very, very aware of covering up their arms or covering up certain portions of their body, this may be what we have found to be a sign that they are cutting themselves. So all of a sudden, if it's 80 degrees in your youth room and everybody in youth is wearing very long sleeves all the time, this might be a warning sign to be attentive to. So plan tight and lead loose. Create a plan to prepare when things go deeper than you'd anticipate. You don't have to force depth, but don't get caught unprepared if things go deep. I have DREs and ministers call me frequently saying that their youth advisors are sharing that their youth group sessions are almost becoming therapy sessions where there is such an intensity of emotion being expressed. And, this is wonderful and substantial that youth have a place to share that honestly, but have a plan. If a youth does express during a youth group session that they cannot think a single positive thought, or perhaps they're making a plan for suicide, don't just hold their hand and say, oh, please don't think about it, and then leave it at that. Actually have a protocol and a plan of how, as youth advisors, you will reach out to your DRE and minister. Please don't be naive. Be ready. Never hesitate to check in. I am a very intuitive person. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. I've worked on it. And make sure that if you feel like that sort of tuning fork in your gut is ringing, that there's some red flags or some of these warning signs, follow your instincts and check in with youth. But here's the difference. Also check in with the other adults. Did you hear that? Did it sound that way to you? Are you also concerned? Make sure that you absolutely are talking with other adults when you check in with that youth. And this often happens in OWL sessions as well. So also help, if you're a DRE on this webinar, make sure that you do some of this training with your OWL facilitators. We haven't mentioned that, but it's something that I hear quite frequently, the depth of sharing that goes on in OWL. Make sure that you also have all of these protocols and plans in place as well. Here's something that can feel counterintuitive. Don't take responsibility for others' problems. Sometimes our own egos get inflated with the sense that we can rescue or somehow save a youth. And this is really an inflated sense. We want to be a witness and we want to be therapeutically helpful. We want to be loving and deeply caring, but we cannot take responsibility for other people's problems. The response is not one where you're taking the responsibility. You're simply making sure that that youth feels deeply listened to and that you're attentive to what's going on with their lives. Stick with the here and now, folks. I'm not a psychologist. Maybe somebody on this webinar is, but we aren't trained to go into deep behavioral therapy that goes back into early issues or family systems. We want to make sure that we're listening attentively, but deal with the feelings first. Don't engage in questions that ask probing questions about the past. Make sure that you help them express. Are you mad? Are you sad? Are you glad? Are you, whatever those feelings are, stay in that feeling first mode. Sometimes in that helpful mode, the inclination is to solve problems, but you're there to listen and help them evaluate their options. And that's the part I want you to hold on to. If you get anything tonight, hold on to the fact that your job is to help them see a little bit light on the horizon, that there's always a next step. There's always, if you weather through the storm, there will be light on the other side, hopefully. And help them evaluate their options and steps going forward. So while youth advisors may be the first responders to youth in crisis, because hopefully you have a depth of direct relationships with those youth, also folks, please, please, please have relationships with your minister and DRE. If you explore this model of having a lay pastoral care team of youth and adults in your congregation, do so with a training or a meeting with your minister and DRE saying, this is an idea we just encountered at this webinar. We want to make sure that we're sharing the same lay pastoral care practices, that perhaps there is an adult lay pastoral care team working with the minister. Don't make it a second thought later on to inform your minister. Of course, involve your DRE if you're exploring this, and then perhaps even have regular, maybe monthly check-ins with that DRE minister before problems arise, saying, I'm hearing some real sharing from this particular youth that their family is really having some crises, and perhaps we could reach out and the minister. So check in regularly. You have a vital role in keeping those teens and young adults in our churches safe and cared for. These youth ministry teams should make explicit what are the boundaries and limitations of advisor and youth pastoral conversations. Also, looking at the job description of the advisor and their skill level. How does that advisor and the DRE create regularity around checking in about the pastoral care needs of the youth group? And how does your youth ministry team involve family support for pastoral care needs? I hope you know the parents of the youth who are participating, and knowing that sometimes the issue is the family relationships is also important.
So we've been talking, and now we really want to hear from you. I am hoping that this brought up a lot of stuff and maybe brought up more questions than answers, but if you would, please go into the chat box and type away, ask anything that you want, and we've got plenty of time to answer questions, and Kim will field our questions for us. Oh, I see one. What is exoticism, which is from Courtney? So I don't have a dictionary definition, but I can say that oftentimes youth of color will experience, especially, for example, if it's one youth of color in a group of white youth, that it's like super cool and super kind of other. It's a kind of othering that actually is intended to lift up this youth as being special or unique or very exotic, but it has the same impact as other racial stereotypes.
I'd like to address that question from Katie. Hey, Katie, asking about budgeting issues. And can you hear me okay? I'll hold this mic up again. How's the volume? Okay. The trainings, if you want to send a team of youth and adults to a youth ministry chaplaincy training, it depends on the region. But if, for instance, in the MidAmerica region, the trainings are about $40 to $60 per person, depending, and the travel, of course, getting them there. So I would say at least $300 a year to make sure that you can keep a pastoral care group trained. $250 to $300. And
there are grants. You may be able to check with Congregational Life. I'm not sure, but I know that with the Office of Youth and Young Adult Ministries, I'll put that link in the resources as well. There's youth leadership grants to help youth develop their skills in congregations.
So the next question is from Brian. He says, as a male youth advisor, he's aware that a number of the young women in his youth group might be uncomfortable speaking with him about intimate matters of sexuality. Is there Anything you'd like to say in response to that, Nancy or Jennica?
Well, certainly don't initiate those conversations. You know, and sometimes we feel like it isn't pastoral to invite another adult to be in that conversation. I've never hesitated to say, let's go over and also talk with. And so, for instance, if you are feeling uncomfortable as a male with a female, invite in another female youth advisor or another advisor to help with that conversation. So, I mean, that's just one thought. Jenica, anybody else?
Well, I would echo what you've been saying throughout the webinar, Nancy, about that it's a team approach, that it's definitely, it takes a lot of self-awareness as well to know, for example, what I'm most likely to be approached about because maybe I share an identity with a youth, and what just really isn't going to be my realm of expertise. And so if I can notice that something's going on, but be self-aware enough that it's probably not me who's the best first responder, then if I'm working in a team, I can tap on somebody else and say, hey, go check in with that youth.
And Jennica, do you just want to confirm for people that the Chrysalis program is still functioning? There was a rumor out there that it wasn't.
Okay, so here's the deal with the Chrysalis trainings. Here's the short deal with the Chrysalis trainings. Some regions or districts are doing chaplain trainings under the Chrysalis heading because they've taken the UUA resource and developed something that's more responsive to their regional needs, and those are Chrysalis chaplain trainings. Some regions or districts aren't doing Chrysalis chaplain trainings as they are, so it's really, if you're in a district or a region that isn't currently hosting chaplain trainings, it would be worth reaching out to congregational life staff to say, hey, who is doing a training? Where can I go? And then reaching out to the Office of Youth and Young Adult Ministries, maybe for a travel grant if it's a training that's outside your district.
Those are all the questions we have at this moment. Oh, wait, just kidding. One just came in as soon as I opened my mouth. Knowing that there are many issues that arise in congregational pastoral care teams, how do we navigate the boundaries and age appropriateness of a youth on a congregational pastoral care team?
With practice and explicit outline of boundaries, and you really don't want to say yes to every youth who wants to be a lay pastoral care provider, even if they've been to the training. If they don't have the level of maturity, this is more about being popular or being overreactive, you have to be aware of who are the right youth. We have some exemplary, amazing youth lay pastoral care providers in the MidAmerica region who've gone on to serve at Youth Caucus, at GA, and they are incredible. And it takes practice. We ask that youth shadow another youth at our events so they can get some on-the-ground training. We also have debrief sessions. I think that's really important. And also making sure that there's always a sense of what exactly are the expectations when they know to hand off. If it is a youth who says, I can only tell you that I'm actually having suicidal thoughts youth to youth, that youth should know in an age-appropriate way that's beyond their scope of help. What they need to do with that youth then is say, let's go over and talk together. I will go with you. Let's share this because we just want you to be okay. The youth who try to rescue other youth, and we've all seen this in youth groups, there's this sense that sometimes a youth will share something and everything stops in the youth group to rescue or to somehow problem fix what's going on with that one particular youth. That's not particularly helpful. It is helpful that there's a place of catharsis. There is a place where a youth can honestly and trustfully express themselves. But the youth who you actually designate as lay pastoral care providers, again, working with adults, know that sometimes it's important to circle back and never to hesitate to say we need to talk with an adult as well.
Yes, and to be clear, youth who would serve in the sort of pastoral care role would be peer chaplains. And so the active listening, the deep listening, that would be a peer-to-peer relationship. So we'd never ask a youth to provide pastoral care to provide a serious amount of pastoral care for adults in the congregation. So when we're talking about youth participating on congregational pastoral care teams, I think of it more as, what are the roles that the sort of casserole committee serves, the more service oriented rather than the, going deep and being there for someone in a more listening role, if that makes sense.
I'll just give you a quick example for that, because as a parent, I had a child who wanted to be involved in helping in the congregation, and she was 9 years old, so totally not age appropriate for her to be doing any deep listening. But she could volunteer to go walk somebody's dog when they were in the hospital, and she could volunteer to help me prepare a meal, and I would take her to deliver it. So it was totally age appropriate at that time. And maybe it will open the door for her being more involved in pastoral care as an older person. We don't yet know how that will play out.
I just wanted to offer up another example of the sort of age appropriateness of youth. And thank you so much for that clarification, Jennica. This is important. This is peer youth to youth pastoral care we're talking about. At the Youth Ministry Revival in Portland this last September, a team, including myself, came from MidAmerica, 2 youth and 2 adults. Actually, Shannon Harper, who now serves in the Central East region, who's a member of our Youth Ministry Roundtable. And our whole workshop was about how to be a community of care and talking about all these practical things: community attention, making sure there's some lay pastoral care support in our congregations. But it also highlighted the expression of creativity in using worship and spiritual practices. We haven't talked much about that tonight, but that's a perfect fit for your youth lay pastoral care providers to be able to have songs that bring uplift, to be able to help whoever your worship coordinators are in your youth group. Those lay pastoral care providers are perfect folks, and that's a part of the Chrysalis training, is helping their worship skills. So they could be really helpful in doing, believe it or not, body praying, liturgical dance, where they actually have a great song with a great message, and they do a coordinated movement of different levels of ability, helping doing mandalas. All of these things are helpful ways to provide pastoral care that your youth chaplains, your lay pastoral care youth chaplains, can help with as well.
I think that is officially it for questions at this time, Nancy and Jennica.
Well, then we have some questions for you.
Sorry, my device went quiet there for me. So in this spectrum of neurodiversity, there's a wide range of reactions to what for some may be fun and engaging practices. So I've been in Unitarian Universalist religious education as a professional for about 20 years. And when I began as a DRE, there was a book that was used quite widely called Deep Fun, and many congregations still have a copy of Deep Fun. And there were some wonderful, beautiful, just fabulous ways to make sure that there was a deepening of fellowship in a fun, kind of engaging way. But some of those practices, and this really came from listening to youth, not just from the adult perspective, that really were physical, that really emphasized a kind of a sort of a level of physicality that especially people on the Asperger's spectrum, the youth on the Asperger's spectrum, really would shut down. If folks who've been around for a while remember, like foofing and wink and especially, the things that I was talking about earlier that we take for granted, that, who are my friends and neighbors, we're all running around and scrambling for chairs. I've actually seen youth weep. That sounds strange, but it creates anxiety, this physicality, this running around. And it's not sensitive to the fact that this may not be right for everyone. Well, many youth loved these activities, and I've had long conversations with youth who really felt like they were grieving for the fact that we've moved beyond some of these particular activities. And I've always welcomed them to come up with new ways to be mindful of that spectrum and that neurodiverse awareness. We don't want our fellowship activities and the way that we bond to create anxiety. So how does your youth group keep the lens of neurodiversity focused in your welcoming games and activities? So that's one of our questions for you. And this may be totally new to you. And are we going to give time for folks to write in the chat box? Or are we just asking? I can't recall.
We've got time, and actually this is something that I'm particularly interested in as well. I'd love to I'd love to hear. And these are also questions that you can take back to your youth ministry leadership teams for deeper reflection as well.
Now, it will be irritating if I start humming the Jeopardy theme, but it's okay if folks don't respond. Even if this is just an aha moment, that would be wonderful. Because often the ways that we have known, we often sometimes have missed and have not used that lens of sensitivity to realize perhaps that youth who didn't come back that second or third time is because they were physically shutting down by the fact that there was this really raucous, fun, boisterous kind of like way to get to know one another. Just have some choices. There's nothing wrong with physical game. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to just say there's just one way to do that. Ooh, here's one. So with the CUC, youth cons have alternate activities when very physical games are offered. Right on, that's righteous. Thank you so much. Also, Rebecca shares that you all leave ample time for check-in and let the youth pick the games. That's super, thank you, Rebecca, but I'm hoping that you also have, again, if you have a couple youth wearing that lens of lay pastoral care, that they've got something ready that could be inviting to folks who aren't as comfortable with a very active game. And if you don't have something ready, that means perhaps that differently abled youth will never come to youth group because they've actually heard that that's the only norm there is. This is from Maya. We honestly don't use games because we have so many neuroatypical youth. That's fascinating. And that is what they're comfortable with. That's very interesting. And thank you so much for that sharing. And there's other ways to bond. Games necessarily aren't the only way. I appreciate that sharing. Excuse me, anybody else? And wouldn't it be neat if we actually shared some of these techniques that we come up with? Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze.
I'll ask the next question. So, does your youth advising team share the practice of meeting with your DRE or minister to talk through any pastoral care concerns? And if so, what does that look like? And if not, might you be interested in considering that? I'll share from my own experience when I was advisor years ago that we didn't have a regular practice of meeting, and that meant when pastoral issues did come up, I personally felt very unprepared, and we sort of had to scramble into crisis mode, whereas I think if we had had a regular practice of talking through and about it, when actual pastoral issues did arise, I would feel a little more equipped and supported as, you know, an advisor that was working just a couple hours a month.
I see that Jonah has shared, and thanks for coming back. You've taken part in a couple of these. Not as a practice regularly, but only in times of acute need. And then James has shared that your DRE is one of your youth advisors. And I lost that. Let's see. And so you do check in with the minister regularly. Lovely. The term neurodiverse is new. Yeah, we have a remarkable DRE in Louisville, Kentucky. Her name is Lynette Lau, and we have a marvelous archived webinar, which I will share when we send out resources and links. That's all about neurodiversity, but simply just means that there's lots of different pathways of learning. We've talked about this for years and forms of multiple intelligence, but neurodiversity shows a level of sensitivity to the way we receive information and the way that we are able to learn and to take in and to be aware. And it's a beautiful, marvelous webinar. I'm not an expert on this, but my consciousness was raised by Lynette Lau. Oh, interesting. Okay.
And I actually just had another aha of a way these pastoral conversations as a team looked when I was on staff for Goldmine, both in the Pacific Northwest and again in Central East. That, it's late at night, it's midnight. The last thing I want to do is sit around a table and rehash the day. But I go to these meetings with the other adult staff and the youth staff, and we just process. Was there anybody that you want to lift up as really getting it today, or was there anybody that you're a little concerned about? And the first 5 minutes would be no, not really. And then all of a sudden, kind of would start to become more real that we are actually in a role of being able to see the group dynamic in a way that you can't really see when you're in it because we're on staff. And so we'd have conversations about cliques that we saw forming, or youth that we saw withdrawing, or youth that we were really excited about that it was what's the word I'm looking for? I became aware that they had really gotten a concept, and so maybe we would tap them to help them teach that concept the following day. And that was a really powerful time for us to bond as a team, but also for us to see ourselves as caring for the larger community.
One piece for those of you who are DREs, you may have taken the Teacher Development Renaissance module, which really emphasizes the importance of the spirituality and having teaching teams which really nurture one another. So as youth advisors, for those of you who are on a team of youth advisors, take that time to check in with one another, just not about the cares and concerns of what you're observing, but also what are you carrying heavily upon your heart? What do you need to share with those other adults, perhaps which changes the way that you actually can interact with the group? Perhaps you're going through a difficult time and you yourself are having a hard time thinking a positive thought, or whatever that is. That healthy self-awareness is the absolute first step to providing good pastoral care. So it's okay to say, I need some pastoral care, and also to have a practice with your other youth advisors, perhaps a chalice lighting, a centering, a question which engages deeper listening, or even a time of silence. So I hope that you do take that time.
So we wanted to leave you with some next steps. I know that this may be quite overwhelming if you're trying to implement all these things and change overnight, but you don't have to do that. What I would urge you to do is just pick one of these things, something that spoke to you in the webinar, or something from this list that you can experiment with and make your own. So what are you interested in taking back to your youth ministry leadership team? Maybe it's youth group greeters. Maybe it's inviting folks to share their pronouns, and also talking through, that it isn't mandatory that we share pronouns, but making that invitation available, starting a community attention each week, sending youth to a peer chaplain training, or creating a plan for attending to the warning signs that we talked about earlier. So in addition to just implementing one thing, consider sometime in the new year committing to one 1-hour session that you could do with a multi-generational crowd. Maybe it's the covenant session and bringing the web to life, or the active listening session. Maybe it's creating or finding a session on self-awareness and boundaries and consent. Or maybe it's getting together and meditating or praying or holding in your hearts members of the congregation that need attention.
Do we have time, Jennica, to answer Mia's question, or Maya, what is meant by community attention?
Yes.
This is really a great technique. And again, I mentioned it happens at youth conferences, at youth leadership schools. Basically, you introduce it as a thoughtful way for individuals to express themselves, but they're doing it on a card or a piece of paper and putting it in a box. You're asking them to put their name upon it. And they will say something like, no one ever listens to so-and-so, or I never feel heard, or every time the group gets going, it's also physical, I just want to step back, or I'm full of joy about how thoughtful and kind everyone is to one another, and when I shared such and such, I felt so affirmed. It's your lay pastoral care team, your advisors working with a couple of youth who look at those community attention cards or pieces of paper, and it's a kind of covenant minding as well, because it then helps you reference back, well, what did we say about being attentive to one another, or respectful, or whatever that is. I think it's actually something that even adult groups need. I think it's an amazing way to just have the pulse beat of the experience, and to have a way to do that kind of thoughtful interaction, which really does an observation as well. But you want to do it prayerfully, you want to do it quietly, you want to do it thoughtfully. It's not like, anyway, now I'm going over time. So I'll be happy to, if you want to write or send me an email, I'll be happy to talk more about it.
And a quick answer to the question of what are pronouns. So pronouns are how we would describe our gender in third person. So my pronouns are she, her, but sometimes the pronouns that you use don't match the way you present, or the way you are presenting that day. And so it's become a practice to go around the circle and say your name and your pronouns. Some people use the pronouns they, them, theirs. And it's also become a practice to make sure that that's an invitation and not a mandate, because some people are still, or some people aren't ready to share their true pronouns, or are still in discernment about what their pronouns are. So here is a list of resources. It is a very short list. It is not exhaustive, and we will be sending you a larger list of some resources, some of the stuff that we've talked about in this webinar, and you'll get that in your inbox soon. And I have some closing words by Darcy Roque. There is too much hardship in this world to not find joy every day. There is too much injustice in this world to not right the balance every day. And there is too much pain in this world to not heal every day. Each of us ministers to a weary world. Let us go forth now and do that which calls us to make this world more loving, more compassionate, and more filled with the grace of divine presence every day. May it be so.
Thank you, dear souls, for all that you do for our youth, and thank you so much for taking part tonight.
And this webinar was brought to you by the Youth Ministry Roundtable, which is a collaboration of Youth and Young Adult Ministries and Congregational Life staff. And after the holidays, we are back with the Inclusive Youth Ministry in a Diverse World webinar, and that is with Elizabeth Wynn in the Office of Youth and Young Adult Ministries, and that's January 10th and January 12th. So look for that registration on uua.org/YM webinars. Thank you so much. It was great to be with you all tonight.
Take care.